Hi, I just wanted to give you one brief example of why you have to read news critically. Now, there's a lot of talk in America recently about the infotainment industry led by CNN, headed off by Fox, where people really aren't giving news or giving entertainment that is filtered with a little bit of news. So it's not even like Saturday Night Live. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of how the drama really goes when you see it on the pages. I'm looking at the NewYorkTimes.com right now, and two articles from the front page site that is not the print edition, stuck out. How Hef got his groove back. Of course, you know Hef is Hugh Hefner, who founded, Playboy magazine, and really just, you know how people like jokingly say, oh, he set women's rights back 100 years. Well, he did. And I'm not saying that he set women's rights back 100 years because, women having the choice to strip and pose naked, and, to do that. Not that that is in any way lewd. I'm not, assigning a moral value to that. But what I am saying is that there is something very peculiar about the availability of women's bodies and women's flesh. When you look at another one of the articles that's in the New York Times on the front page, it's that there's this persistent um, inequality in women's pay amongst doctors in New York. And what's sad about it is that you look at the article and the researchers like that was what surprised us is that the inequality is getting even greater. I was like, oh, these researchers are guys, right? One author, Anthony T. Lasasso, professor of health policy, and this is what's scary to me because he goes on to say, as you start moving forward in time closer to the present day, to the present day, your ability to explain away that difference between men's and women's salaries essentially evaporates. So they can no longer explain it away. They can no longer explain it away as in women go into, lower paid professions. And there are two problems with that. A, like I said, um, this guy, as researchers, they were puzzled. And I'm not saying that as researchers you know everything. What I am saying is that if research is about questions, you keep asking questions. And the fact is, they stopped asking questions because they were able to explain away. And so in their minds, it's okay that women, oh, it's a fine that women, go into like family health practice and stuff. And those are family health practice and stuff like that, and they get lower pay. It's fine. That inequality is fine. But because it sounds so logical and so reasonable and presented in such economic terms, it's difficult for us to sometimes sit back and say, well, wait a minute. Don't we value family health medicine and family practice? And, aren't these things that should, people have said, oh, teachers should be paid better. Teachers should be paid better. Well, actually, teachers should be paid better. Really. I mean, um, police, the police force should be better trained. Really. There should be provisions for people, for citizens to go into different kinds of professions, and their parents' ability to pay for that should not be like the deciding factor. Really. So these are things that many people in America agree on, and yet when you look at our propaganda news, you don't see this sort of critical analysis from page to page. And I'm just looking at the cover page of the New York Times on one day, and I'm not even like breaking this stuff down. Like I've read these little articles, and you have this, this really interesting, what could have been a really interesting narrative of how disparity is growing and how gender, race, and class disparities are often tied because on one hand you see women's lives being stretched, on the other hand you see not just black people unemployed, being stretched, but brown people can't even just like be in Arizona without like having to show their papers. So race is being stretched. There's so many things that are being stretched. Our democracy is being stretched. There are people who threaten governors who threatened to secede from the union. The last time we really saw that, we talk about the days of Bull Connor. We're talking about the days of James Meredith trying to register, you know, to go to law school, to go to a public school. And so the kinds of things that we're talking about when we're talking about public goods, they're not like, well, you choose to eat hamburgers, and if I'm not going to put hamburger on your food stamps so you can eat food stamps and Coke because it's bad for you because a certain general says, no, honey, that's not how it works. That's not how it works. That's not what the free market means, and we can just give up everything. And the reason why is that free market thinking, you see it even in the kinds of research that are used, and this is what Cornel Wells talks about in his critiques of bourgeois society. We have to look at the word of bourgeois society. Um, that you have these kinds of rhetoric, including in research, and it makes so much sense. You're always like, oh, and it's presented in the news, and it makes so much sense. Just because somebody can present a logical argument does not mean that it makes sense. I mean, look at those Geico commercials where that guy who's really sensible in a business suit, you know, does Geico save your life? Da 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 da. You bet your screaming frog out of a window, and so you see the next picture, some screaming frog out of the window. But he says it in such a rational way that you're like, oh, okay, that could happen. Pig's fine. Like that. And so that's when you really have to develop a very critical and keen eye to the news. And it's not just the New York Times. I'm not just picking on the New York Times. Um, I subscribe to this. And this is a really interesting, kind of article because then this brings in the last pillar of what I've been talking about. So they say that gender stretched, race. Well, you know what? Class ain't nowhere far behind as Equiano, that slave who brought all those classes together, as he discovered. So class is not far behind. Now, what originally struck me about this edition of The Economist was that they're claiming to be saying that the rich and the rest, and they're claiming to critique this, and on the surface, this looks unfair, so the moral message is consistent. As you read all of the articles, bang on. They have an entire page. I read, so I was like shocked. I'm like, oh my God. They're like, so they have this picture that seems to suggest that these people are hoarding, that these are oligarchs or guards or, gods, or that these people on top are somehow able to control a great amount of power over those minions. That seems very undemocratic, unfair. And yet the article goes on and on and on at length about how the rich have done better than those in the middle class, those who fared relatively poor. Why would the state try and help the poorest at a time when they were doing better than before? And that's what he's arguing that some, economists are hypothesizing. And so they present different arguments from economists, but it all comes down to, the middle class. They just haven't really done really well. And inequality rose and that the poor people gained access to more credit. They have nothing to do with one another. So the fact that, you have this subprime boom in America, and along with those buying those big old houses, people want to fill them up with big old furniture, and they get out their credit cards and stay in debt. For years, they don't talk about anything like this here, and they really try and justify why the rich are so good. So they have their page on philanthropy, and Mr. Facebook was mentioned 10 or 12 times. But here's the part that gets me, and it goes back to what I'm saying, where you have to think critically, where you really have to think critically. And I want to show you these pictures because it's very, very dramatic. So here it is. They got Barack Obama, red tape, right? The red tape giant. He wants to expand government. They're very critical of him on that. But on the very next page, on the very next page, they have, of course, the sexy Latina, but they have defining poverty. How do you measure poverty? There it is, a black family, young kids. We don't even know if those kids are the parents or anything of those kids, but they will be critical of Obama for his watered down um, healthcare reform, but they won't talk about the conservatives, the economic conservatives that they uphold in this very magazine that stood in Obama's way on economic conservative terms. That's what I'm talking about when you have to look at how they present the news. Oh my God, he's red taping, he's scary. And yet, white poverty is invisible. And we think that poverty is just, we think class is really a race thing. And it's too icky to talk about. And so we don't talk about any of it. And yet we present it as, well, Business as usual.